Life in the fast lane may make you want to lose your mind, but I'll tell you what will make you want to lose your mind even faster than life in the fast lane is the inflation rate. Inflation is a much more subtle problem in macroeconomics than unemployment. As you might recall, inflation happens during the good times. Expansion of the business cycle. That's what I'm alluding to. And inflation in itself, the rise or the general rise in the level of prices, isn't such a big deal. But the rate of change of prices is a big deal. As you can see in the image at the bottom left, individuals could technically be classified as millionaires or even billionaires according to the valuation of their currency. Children in the streets of Weimar Germany stacking the German mark up as though it were merely a toy to be played with or to be sat upon by your puppy. But inflation is no joke. When your value of your currency, which is trusted by groups of people, of course, around the world, different currencies in different countries, then what's called purchasing power, this ability to consume, quickly erodes. And I'm sorry, my friends, truthfully, being a billionaire would probably be a lot more awesome if you were in another country where your currency actually retained its value. So keep in mind the inflation rate is the percent change per year in the price index, typically the consumer price index, and it is the inflation rate that helps one to find their real wage, the wage rate divided by the price level, the real income, which is the income divided by the price level. Again, this price level variable comes back to the rate of inflation and the value or the purchasing power of one's currency. Okay, here you can see the inflation rates graphs and the price level versus the inflation rate. The Consumer Price Index is used by the federal government. The Bureau of Labor Statistics collects this measure every quarter and reports it. Here you can see the trend, right? Upward rising prices, and this is normal in the market economy. This is why your grandmother complains about having to, have paid so much less for that gallon of milk. But of course, grandmother, you lived in a time in which you didn't make much money for doing the work that you do, or that you did. So price level versus the inflation rate, there's definitely a difference. Okay, this is the rate at which prices rise, and it's these short-term fluctuations which can bring about damage to the individual's personal finance situation and or to the business financial situation. Okay, so all the individuals and all the businesses together make up the macroeconomy. Thus, we need to understand price level and inflation rate, the relationship between the two, the risks, and the advantages of inflation. All right, as I mentioned, inflation is the rising in the general level of prices. Doesn't mean that all goods and services are increasing in price. It just means that a rather large sample, approximately 80,000 different goods and services that the government collects this data for, are increasing given a rise in the Consumer Price Index or in the Producer Price Index, but it's the Consumer Price Index that we typically look at in AP. And there's the bell for dismissal. Time to go home. Sorry, I can't finish this video. Just kidding. So some examples, right? It takes $2 to buy what $1 bought in 1982. All right. Or it takes $6 to buy what $1 bought in 1961, and if you go back to the 1950s, it may take $7 to buy what $1 would have purchased. So inflation occurs normally. Each dollar of income will buy fewer goods than before, and that is to be expected. Okay, so I mentioned that the government tracks these prices, and this market basket depending on the type of measure, the consumer price index is far more inclusive than merely a handful of items, which you would commonly find at the market. In fact, I want to update these notes to reflect the reality of the broadness of the measure of goods and services in the economy. The inflation rate is a percentage change in prices in a year. So to find the inflation rate, we use the growth formula that was discussed in class, where you take year 2 and you subtract year 1, whether that's GDP or price index or whatever it is that you're looking at, and divide by year 1. Multiply that by 100 to make it a percentage, and that gives you the inflation rate. So let me see if I can find an example. Here's an example from the text, and this is the online version, chapter 24, that shows the price index in a given year. Now, the price index, an index is a number, a numerical value that represents a percentage change from a base year. So let's just look at this table for a moment before we look at the formula. And this table is calculating real GDP. But calculating real GDP and the inflation rate is very related, and I'll show you how in a moment. All right, so we have 5 years, we have a value of output, price for pizza per unit, and a price index value, as well as the nominal GDP and the real GDP. All right, so in the first year, you have nothing to compare price to, and so there's no price change. The price index value is 100, which represents that price level is just at 100%. And the nominal or unadjusted GDP is 50, 5 times 10, the units of output times the price per unit. And the adjusted GDP is also the same, because you're in the base year 1. In the next year, though, you do increase output and prices change. So there is, a simplified example here, inflation, right? Prices have gone up, and the price index measure of 100 or of 200 shows you the difference between 200 and 100 is 100, that there's a 100% increase in prices, or inflation is at 100%. The unadjusted or nominal GDP is 140, multiplying output times price, and the adjusted or real GDP is 70. Okay, and so we use the growth formula to see what is the change in GDP, and then all we do to find a real GDP is actually to multiply this year's output by last year's price. So 7 times 10 is 70. And we could go on and we'd do the same thing for each year, and you could quickly find the real GDP output. It would be 80, 100, 110. Compared to the nominal GDP, that's a really big difference. As you continue here through column 4, this change in nominal or unadjusted GDP is very much inflated because of the change in prices or the inflation rate. Okay, so back to the price index. Again, this price index is a number that shows the rate of inflation, or the inflation rate, right? So we take, again, looking back at real GDP, the price of a market basket in a given year divided by the base year multiplied by 100. This would give us the price index for that year. Another way to think about it. All right, so real GDP is nominal GDP divided by the price index in hundreds. Another way to redefine this formula for the price index is to say that price index is equal to nominal GDP over real GDP. Okay, and yeah, so there's an example from the online text. That's chapter 24, page 491, I believe. Okay, a moment ago I showed you an example from chapter 24 in the online text. Here in chapter 26 is more information specifically about inflation. So this is the 18th edition text. And you see consumer price index, as we've been talking about, and it does reference the example I gave you a moment ago with GDP and using the price index. So the price index, CPI, inflation, very interrelated. You understand the CPI is the tool that the government used to measure the inflation rate, and the price index then is the score or the measure for which we use to find real GDP, price changes, and so on. All right, so the formula given here is for the consumer price index. price of the most recent market basket in particular year divided by the price estimate of the market basket in a base year. And the base year, which is commonly used for many government statistics today, is a kind of an average actually of prices from 1982 to 1984. It was a fairly stable period for prices, and so government sees this as a reliable period to look back to for a base comparison. Okay, so the rate of inflation formula, let me slide this over a little bit, is really just the growth formula that we used in class on Monday, you macroeconomics students of mine. Year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1 times 100, and this rate of inflation for this expanse of time, 2006-2007, is 2.8%. All right, so pretty moderate inflation, 2.8%. That is over a percentage point higher than we saw last year in 2014. But again, not far off of the average. So that's how to find the rate of inflation. And next up, we'll look at who's helped and who's hurt. There's several degrees of price instability, and before we take a look at the winners and losers when inflation occurs, we should point out that price instability could mean prices are rising. That's inflation. It could also be a fall in prices and wages caused by a fall off in consumer and producer demand. This was the case in the U.S. economy from 2008 to 2009, and is currently the case in the European Union, as deflation is a real threat to wages and for business owners, of course. Stagflation is a rise in unemployment and inflation that could occur at the same time. This is caused generally by a rise in raw material prices combined with hard macroeconomic times. And in the U.S. we saw this from 1980 to 81. So stagflation is a real scary situation economically. Hyperinflation is high or ultra-high inflation, which varying definitions of hyperinflation, but generally greater than 50% inflation rate per month. And this is hard for us to envision, but various countries recently have seen this, Venezuela being one, where their GDP report seems extravagant and really awesome, but then when you look more closely, you see, well, there's actually just very high inflation in that country, and so GDP is not all that great. So, again, Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, some key examples that we've gone over in class, where hyperinflation sets in and consumers have a real difficulty getting goods the traditional way using a country's currency. Okay, so in class we looked at inflation that occurs without anticipation and unexpected inflation. And so some individuals are definitely hurt, especially banks and lenders who give money at a fixed interest rate. Now, some banks can offer variable interest, and that's one way for them to protect themselves against inflation, because they could raise interest rates over time. And of course, it's wise when you borrow to understand what type of rate you're getting. Fixed interest could hurt the lender, but actually could help the borrower, because you're going to be paying back what is owed with money now that is less valuable. So you couldn't have purchased as much with that money had you used it for something else. So the inflation, in effect, kind of helps you. You still have to pay back your debt, but it's with money that's not worth as much. People with fixed incomes are also hurt, and savers. People who have money in an account, for instance, that's not earning very much, say less than a percentage, and if inflation is over 1%, then of course you're losing purchasing power with that money sitting idly in some account. Businesses can be helped where the price of the product increases faster than the price of resources, and individuals who receive some sort of cost of living adjustment or COLA adjustment in their wages that mirror inflation could see rising wages to the rate at which inflation is rising, which is not a big deal if you're the employer with that arrangement. Okay, there's your overview of inflation. Next up, we'll see how to measure